Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Courtauld. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Catherine Grant. I am a reader in modern and contemporary art, and I'm very excited to be hosting this panel about this very beautiful publication, Photography, A Queer History. So just a little note on how today is going to run. I will introduce the two book authors, and then they're going to give us a little bit of insight into some of the works in the publication, and then I will be in conversation with them. I will open it up to the floor for any questions, but probably very importantly, there are drinks and books for sale afterwards, and that will just be in the Research Forum seminar room down the road. So I should just mention a brief content note. I expect most of you are expecting this, but there will be images of nudity and also some sexually explicit works. I'm kind of saying this probably more for the YouTube recording than maybe the people in the room. If you're watching this on your laptop with a small child, maybe, you know, kind of sort of don't. So I'm going to now welcome our two authors. So Flora Dunster is a senior lecturer at Central St Martin's, so just down the road, where she's course leader of MA Contemporary Photography. She works on histories of queer and lesbian photography in the UK, and recent writing can be found in Third Text, the Routledge Companion to Global Photographies, and Resist, Organised Build, Feminist and Queer Activism in Britain and the United States during the long 1980s. She is also the co-editor with Theo and also Fiona Anderson, who's here, and Laura Guy, who is not. They're co-editing a special issue of British Art Studies on queer art in Britain since the 1980s. And I believe that's going to be out in May next year, and I think it's sort of hotly anticipated by many of us. So that will be a kind of a sort of an interesting project alongside this book. And so Theo is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the History of Art at the University of York. He is working on a book provisionally titled Viral Landscapes, Art and HIV/AIDS in the UK. He graduated with a PhD from the Courtauld in 2018 and has written widely on contemporary art with essays on Helen Chadwick, Douglas Crimp, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Sunil Gupta and other artists. As well as being the co-author of this book, he's also edited We Were Here, a book of Sunil Gupta's essays for Aperture, and as I've already mentioned, is one of the co-editors of Queer Art in Britain. So I'm going to hand over to Theo and Flora to introduce the book.
So what we're going to do, thank you, Catherine. And what we're going to do is kind of talk for about 15 minutes and just walk through, I guess, some of our thinking behind the book and the process of putting it together, and preempt some of Catherine's questions down the line. So we're just going to kind of go back and forth and walk through a few of the things that we were thinking about kind of before and during the process of compiling the volume. So I think that the sort of first thing that we wanted to flag is that when we were approached to make the book, we were a little bit reluctant at first. Partly because we both work in a kind of academic context, and so the idea of trade publishing is quite new to us. And because we didn't want to sort of replicate the idea that images of queerness are either sort of celebratory or mournful. So there was sort of talk of like pride parades and protests, and we were really kind of clear with each other that that's not what we wanted to do. But when we started kind of talking about the project between the two of us, we realized that this was a chance to kind of break out of maybe an expected canon of what we sort of anticipate queer photography to look like. So to kind of move beyond a book that would be sort of images by Mapplethorpe and Catherine O'Bee, and a canon which tends to circulate around American photographers in particular. That was something that we were really keen to try and disrupt. So we accepted the invitation to make the book after realizing that the kind of volume that we wanted to make didn't exist, and that there was this sort of opportunity to perhaps fill a gap in the literature. So we decided that what we wanted to kind of do was make something that would be critical. So not just a really beautiful book, although that was definitely, having the opportunity to work in a kind of trade publication capacity with a budget was really, really incredible. We were talking to Rosie Martin, one of the photographers, just now about being able to actually publish her work in color, which is something that there wasn't budget for, perhaps, in some of the publications that had previously appeared in the 80s and 90s. So being able to actually platform works in that way. So that was one of the things we wanted to do. But we also didn't want to kind of make a book that would address the idea of queer photography at face value. We wanted to make something that would kind of interrogate how queer and photography hang alongside each other, and kind of really push at the instability of those terms independently together, and think about what they can kind of do in conversation. We wanted to make something that would reflect the breadth and diversity of practitioners working with and between these two ideas, both historically and in the present. And the project subsequently developed out of a really intense period of research. So we spent a lot of time compiling spreadsheets and lists and going back and forth and trying to kind of strike the right balance so that the book would speak not just to queer in a kind of Euro-American context that we're perhaps more used to, but that it would kind of bring in work that could challenge that context and maybe make the image of queer more complex.
Hey, my turn. Nice to see you all. We were very keen to compile the book in a way that would work against expectations regarding genre. So while it does include chapters on portraiture, landscape and documentary, perhaps more traditionally photographic categories, it also includes chapters on ideas around archiving, materiality, fantasy, protest, and the very idea of queerness itself. So Wolfgang Tillmans, for example, is someone who kind of crops up in two different places in the book, and we really wanted to kind of put his work to work in that sense. And so within that, we intentionally tried to cross wires. So putting photographers where you might not expect them, or to open up how we position their practices and encourage a more capacious understanding of their work. But also to underscore that perhaps the headings and categories are in many ways quite arbitrary. And the structure of the book was kind of given to us, as a replication of Photography, A Feminist History, which is the previous title in the series. But we were dissatisfied with that, and so thought about ways to trouble it. So as an example of that, you'll find Peter Hujar in a chapter on landscape, and Laura Aguiar, whose work is really about landscape, I suppose, in the final section instead on an open mesh of possibilities. So that has a kind of methodological reflection. We wanted to approach the idea of photography in a queer way, and to resist the idea of its categorization, even as we had to use it.
One thing that we were really keen for the book to emphasize is the idea that photography is active, agential, that it's something that works after the moment of its creation and has the capacity to organize, incite, bond, disturb. The idea that photographs are not just products of photographers, but these kind of sites of potential that open onto ways of being in the world or ways of seeing it. We also wanted to emphasize how photographs function in kind of broad and networked ways, not just as sort of rarefied forms of fine art production and display, so perhaps like the previous slide, like the Tillmans, but how images speak to each other, speak outside of their local or historical contexts, and how they kind of come to create new ones, particularly work which circulates in more ad hoc or kind of colloquial ways, like this image of Maud Allen. Our thinking around archives, which I have to say was heavily influenced by Catherine, was really key to this. For instance, our thinking around the Archivo de la Memoria Trans, the Trans Memory Archive, which is a collection of photos from Argentina that kind of documents the lives of trans people in the latter half of the 20th century. Or this photograph of Maud Allen, the Canadian dancer whose interpretation of Oscar Wilde's Salome saw her accused of being in the cult of the clitoris. These are two very different kinds of network, one more private, which speaks to the importance of personal collections, and one more public, which becomes what Pauline Boudry and Renata Lawrence call an infectious image. But the circulation of both these different sort of forms of image does something in terms of a wider social context. In both cases, these images create contexts, collecting viewers at the moment of their initial circulation, but also working across time and space. And the hope was that by putting these images in conversation with more traditional sort of art photography, the ways in which a picture of queerness forms would start to become clear. So to kind of trouble the idea that there are sort of registers of photography, and to kind of flatten that out by including different kinds of image across these chapters, which are already trying to kind of undo themselves by nature of their design.
Okay, so I'm just going to end this brief introduction by talking about the ethos of the last chapter of the book, which draws on what, in a mercenary sense, draws on Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's writing on queerness as an open mesh of possibilities, and how we wanted to use that idea in the last chapter to kind of undo the rest of the work that the book has done to that point, to keep queerness as a space which is unknown and in motion. Following that idea, we decided to end with Eve Lomax and kind of return differently to some of the generative potential of her work, Open Rings and Partial Lines, which is a work of arguably of refusal, of withholding, or of lacking coherence. It's difficult, it's frustrating, it's hard. Historically, Lomax's work marked a moment in the mid-80s that sexual difference theory was deteriorating or starting to collapse, and which she teased apart in a process of what she called menacing repetition. So it seemed apposite to enact that repetition with a difference as our own final gesture in the book, one of conclusion that promises unending or perpetual motion. It was also important to us to finish on the openings to queerness through lesbian desire.
Thank you.
That's it.
So, thank you for that introduction. I think I've definitely found reading this book that it goes beyond what you would typically expect from a kind of a sort of survey or an anthology publication. But I was also thinking about how much this is kind of a welcome addition to publications on queer art, and how there aren't really that many to sort of compare it with. It comes alongside Gemma Rolls-Bentley's book on queer art that was also kind of launched here very recently. And it shocked me to realise it's been just over a decade since Catherine Lord and Richard Mayer's Art and Queer Culture compilation. I was like, oh, that's quite recent. Oh, no, it isn't. Okay. And there's been a special issue of Aperture magazine in 2015 under the thematic title Queer. That's kind of out of print pretty much. And Laura Guy did a an article for Source magazine, a photography magazine in 2014, which asked, is there such a thing as queer photography? And if so, how could we go about writing its history? And this kind of feels like one of the sort of iterations of that conversation that's been had across a number of scholars. I mean, there's also exhibition catalogues that mostly chart queer approaches in a broader context. We could think of the Guggenheim's 1997 exhibition, A Rose is a Rose is a Rose, which was subtitled Gender Performance in Photography, which I still kind of return to. It hasn't kind of been superseded really. Or more recently, the Hayward's 29 exhibition, Kiss My Genders, or the New Museum's Trigger, Gender as a Tool and a Weapon from 2018. But in terms of a kind of a critical resource, I don't think there's really been anything that has taken over a collection that is now over 25 years old, The Passionate Camera, Photography and Bodies of Desire, which was edited by Deborah Bright. And I think reading your publication, that seemed to be a kind of a touchstone for you as well, even though that collection is of critical essays rather than kind of a compilation of artists. But I thought in terms of questions, for me, I know that both of you have been researching kind of histories of queer photography for quite some time, and I thought it would be really good if you could maybe just talk a little bit about your research and kind of how you've been thinking about queer photography more specifically from your different research areas. Should I turn to Flora first?
Yeah, so I guess, am I speaking to a microphone?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
I kind of came to the subject area through my PhD, which I wrote about Tessa Baughman and Della Grace Volcano, and about the kind of move that lesbian photographers in London in the 1980s and 90s made towards visualizing something that became evident maybe in hindsight as queer, or which was claimed as queer very, very vocally in the moment. There's sort of two different ways into it. So I guess my thinking around queer photography and what queerness looks like in photography has always been underscored by the insistence that, what Theo's has as well, that like lesbian is at the heart of what queer looks like and comes to mean, which, as Theo said, was a big kind of ethic of the book, making sure that it wasn't just American photographers, white photographers, and then gay photographers, which is why the sort of complicated rubric of lists started to become really trying to like get the right balance to sort of weed people out from that. But yeah, that was the sort of perspective that I came to it from.
Hi. So I would, just to pick up on that specifically before I answer the question, is that, so in there we also wanted to thread through as a theme the ways that lesbian and trans producing each other historically, and as a resistance to perhaps some of the ways that certain parties want to cleave those apart now. And so that's a kind of persistent thread that runs through several of the chapters in the book. Well, my approach to it comes more from HIV/AIDS histories and the importance of photography there. And the research I'm doing now on what it might be to have a British, how we can understand what a British HIV/AIDS artistic response is. But that book, in that book that I'm writing right now, photography has a very kind of important place, kind of like a fulcrum, if you like, for the ways that different practices kind of circulated around or were put to work or were made to travel and used in different ways to address HIV/AIDS in Britain specifically right now. But I have previously worked more on responses in the USA.
Thank you. And I think the location of both of your research kind of is more weighted towards the 1980s. So I was interested in how you found kind of researching an entire history in this book, and maybe we could start off with you discussed how you focused on younger artists and artists from outside of Europe and America, and I was wondering kind of you know, sort of how you did that research and kind of how you compiled that kind of sort of newer archive of material, and maybe just as a sort of a little hook, like who were some of the artists that you didn't know about before starting the book that now you feel are kind of like really essential artists that we should all know about?
So many. Yeah, we're both really, I don't want to say stuck in the 1980s, but maybe sometimes our brains live in the 1980s. It was actually really, really nice having the kind of remit to research widely and to have to kind of push towards other locations. I think especially when your brain is sort of stuck in one place, then being able to just let it loose and research everything and read everything was really, really nice. So the process of kind of putting the lists together was like stressful only because there were so many people that we wanted to include and couldn't. But yeah, I mean, there's so many photographers whose work I didn't know who I now love, like Mohamed Abdouni is one, who has a show on in Paris at the moment at Galerie Lafayette, which is amazing. The work he does with archives is incredible. It's like that, yeah, that's someone who I now feel like I kind of can't live without.
Yeah, no, there's so many. I think, you know, when you're positioned somewhere, which like you are, it's a challenge to like kind of unposition yourself. And so like we did make an effort. I don't know how successful it was, but there was a lot of thinking in like looking at distribution and like how global it was or how international it was. But then also trying to make the most out of what we could contribute to. And if like, I wouldn't say we're stuck in the 80s, but what I think that is interesting about 80s, that period, is that it is a moment of kind of opening up. And so there's a lot that's very productive in that, and a lot of tools in that, from which to kind of reorientate yourself towards all kinds of new practices. Yeah.
Thank you. And in the introduction to the book, and you touched a little bit on this, you offer, you know, quite a strong polemic on the instability of the term queer and how you see us working in relation to photography. You talked a little bit about how you started to think about creating a queer history of photography, but I wondered if you would talk a little bit more about how you sort of balance the different kinds of iterations of what queer and photography might do together. Like you mentioned Amelia Jones's idea of queer effects, and I wondered sort of how much you wanted to push that into sort of images that might have some queer effects alongside works that are made as explicitly queer works of art. And I think it is a fascinating topic, so I'd just like you to speak a little bit more about it.
We had I think if we had been able to include more images, we did kind of have to start to make cuts at some point where we had a longer list of images that would maybe be quote-unquote queer effects. And then there was a moment where we had to start to cull for the sake of space, and identity politics probably kind of kicked in and came into play, but we did get a really funny email from Jürgen Teller's studio being like, Jürgen would be happy to participate, but he is curious why he's being invited to be in this book. And I was like, it's just a really queer photo. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. It just is what it is. It's Charlotte Rampling drinking milk with a fox. Like, I can't give you a better answer. So like that to me was an example of an image which feels like it has some kind of, which might be totally subjective, it might just be me looking at that photo and I wish we'd been able to include more photos like that, because I do think
Mm-hmm.
that it's interesting to think about the ways in which images become queer but aren't necessarily made through that lens.
Yeah, well, I found the book opens with the kind of Neil Bartlett's book, a section of that book, Ready to Catch Him Should He Fall, where there's like a young guy who's living in London in the 80s. Who collects images from, kind of culls images from, vintage markets and historic photography, images that this character latches onto as somehow productive of himself. And I think that was an interesting model, or like a useful model for us as a starting point for the book, particularly in relation to that those opening chapters, which kind of tackle that historic problem debate of fantasy and reality and documentary. So I think that we left it unresolved from there.
Yeah, I would like to see that list of outtakes that had to be edited. Maybe there's like another whole volume.
Probably.
So my next question kind of relates to that, and you did talk a little bit about this idea, and I wondered how working on the book has impacted your sense of a queer canon, and I sort of say queer canon, because I think even though there aren't that many, kind of like books that chart a history of queer photography, still for those of us working within photography or within kind of art and visual culture more broadly, we'll know kind of a set of photographers or images that will start to kind of form in your mind. And you do have lots of well-known artists and photographers, and it was really a real pleasure to see them grouped together. It wasn't like, oh no, kind of once somebody's got a little bit of kind of fame, then we should like discard them. That's not what you have done in this book. But I just wondered how you kind of approached balancing the well-known with the under-known, and whether you kind of you've got some iconic works, and like with the Peter Hujar, you also have works that are sort of unexpected for a particularly well-known photographer. And I just wondered kind of how much of that did you sort of wrestle with, or were you just sort of playful and just sort of saw what happened?
I can. I would just on that kind of question of history, which was in your previous question as well, but I meant to say is that so in photography of feminist history, there's a timeline which charts kind of significant moments of development in photography alongside significant moments of kind of feminist and queer history. We didn't really want a timeline in this one, but it was going to be in there. It was in the original kind of draft structure. And we really spent a lot of time trying to cut it and kind of thinking about what the timeline would be, and if it's only 2 pages, what can you have in there?
Yeah.
And it ends up actually being very Western-centric in that case. So we kind of argued for it to go, or we kind of cut it down until it was so small that everyone was just like, let's just get rid of this. That kind of also relates to what you're saying about the major and the minor, and about how the book wants to think about them together.
Yeah.
So someone like Mapplethorpe, we had an interesting time with that, because his entry is in a chapter called Dialogues with Pornography. And the Mapplethorpe estate were very unhappy that his name was associated with the word pornography because of the history, which I'm sure many people are aware of, the history of censorship around his work in the late 1980s. And I think that there was a concern, I can't speak for them, but there was a concern, I think, that there was an overdetermination of the work by yoking it to that word. and we'd had to kind of make some edits to appease. But we did manage to keep it where we wanted it.
It was partly my fault because I was really belligerent about having a particular photograph for that entry.
Well, we wanted an explicit picture.
We could have made it easier for ourselves.
But then I think that those categories do some interesting work to group together the different types of work, different types of practice, in famous and less famous practice, and then actually to try and make an equivalence.
But I also think on the kind of topic of canon, I think one of the things that kind of became clear, especially when there were people that we had to have in, not sort of like contractually obliged to, but kind of contractually obliged to include. But then I think one of the things that became kind of clear, especially after it was published, was the way in which there's like a kind of surface canon, but there are these sort of almost like community-facing canons within different pockets of practitioners, and I think something that, like, after like struggling to get it done on a really tight deadline and feeling very, very stressed out and all these things that come with making a book, what was really then quite gratifying was seeing people, especially on social media, kind of commenting and being like, oh my god, you're in it too, like that's great, like, oh, like so-and-so's in it as well, so-and-so's in it, and seeing these like kind of like other forms of canon that are sort of community facing become visible. And I think being able to kind of like group people together in that way, or to include maybe not canons but communities in one place felt really nice as a sort of counterbalance, I guess, to the Mapplethorpes and the OPs.
I think that's testament to how much work you must have done to put this together, because I always think kind of taking on a commission like this is it's very exciting, but it's incredibly scary.
We know now how much work it is.
It's a lot of responsibility, and you have to make a lot of decisions that, kind of like you said, you can't like have everything that you wanted in there. There's a huge amount of editing. What was the pre-existing structure that you had? Was it just the terms of the chapters, or kind of?
It's the timeline.
So there was going to be a timeline. There would be an introduction, and there would be 10 chapters, of which with 10 introductory essays, and then
and a lot less text. I think at some point they just stopped telling us that we were over the word length and accepted.
I was wondering that
everything would be triple the word length, and they'll probably never commission academics to write ever again.
I mean, I must say, like each of the introductions to each of the 10 sections are beautifully crafted kind of entry points into a kind of a world, a set of theories, a set of kind of practices that really, kind of, I was like, very nice. But they are not your typical trade publication sweeping, this is about abstraction, it's abstract, here we go. You delved in much more detail, and I wonder whether did you play with making those 10 chapters chronological, or kind of like how did you end up, because it feels like you've done quite a lot of thinking to define these different ones.
There's a reason for everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a long time ago now, so it's hard to remember the process for that. But I think
we knew where we wanted to begin and where we wanted to end. And then there was a kind of sequencing in the middle, which goes for the names of the artists, like the actual entries were meant to be alphabetical. And that was something that we got really upset about and pushed back on, because we're like, there's a narrative to each.
Yeah, each section, the like 10 or 8 profiles that are in there, we put them in an order for a reason.
Yeah.
So then when we got a proof back and they'd alphabetized everything, we were like, no.
I think we made so many demands that they just gave up at a certain point trying to articulate.
But there's also, like, I think that we start with the first chapter we wrote was the landscape chapter.
Yeah.
So I think that was quite clear quite early on. And then there had to be a chapter kind of on HIV/AIDS somewhere, even though it's not it's kind of not obvious.
Yeah.
And then we knew we had to talk about some kind of ABC photography things, so they went at the beginning, or like some introductory
Kill it
debates.
before we know, Theo, sorry. Well, that is fascinating because it is quite a hard set of slices you've made. I thought I would just read out the titles because not all of you will have had a chance to look through this book yet. It starts off with documenting queer, then access to the real, archives and reenactments, dialogues with pornography, mourning militancy, between performance and photography, space to be seen, queer landscapes, materialities and abstractions, and it ends with an open mesh of possibilities. I mean, even just the titles, there's a nice poetry.
It's like the Madonna album. It launches off.
And then what happens midway through?
Oh, yeah. Some Scott songs you skip.
I didn't skip any songs. Well, that's another whole line of questioning. But okay, well, that's for a different interviewer. I'm sure there's people in the audience who could maybe do those set of questions. But I will go for some more art historical questions. And I was wondering how hard it was to trace queer histories in photography in the pre-20th century and the early 20th century. You've got some pioneers like Alice Austin included, but it made me think about you've talked about Mapplethorpe, but whether any estates or collections didn't want kind of photographers' work to be included in an explicitly queer context?
Yes. Noted contemporary famous photographers.
Yes, probably not the people you would expect.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So not the historical ones?
No.
No.
No. Oh,
It was people who were living.
there was one, there was one historical one. Yeah. But yeah, people who are living or people who are more recently deceased, whose estates didn't want them to be included. I will say one thing about the kind of difficulty of researching is that the project began when the British Library was still closed, which I think also probably has something to do with why it skews more contemporary. Because when we began to research, we were a bit more limited in terms of the materials we actually had available, which was an interesting challenge.
I mean, it speaks to how the term queer has maybe shifted and become more accepted in the last couple of decades. Because I can remember when Alice Austin's kind of estate was not happy.
Interesting.
In that way.
Yeah. I don't remember there being any issues with.
And now it's very celebrated that she was a lesbian, whereas that was not always the case. And it's not within a very long history that has shifted. So it's kind of interesting that actually maybe the hesitations or problems around the term queer. I was very interested in the way you talked about how for some people queer was too much of a Western term or kind of shut down maybe other identifications. And I wondered whether maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how that operates, particularly around sort of Indigenous forms of queer identity, and whether it has changed your thinking about the usefulness of queer as a term, kind of encountering these kind of moments where it hasn't felt adequate.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's sort of one of the difficulties with a project like this, or maybe just with this project specifically, is that I think we did go into the introduction in particular wanting to make it very clear that we're not married to queer as a kind of term, and that's maybe not the best word possible, and that we acknowledge that, and that for a lot of the photographers in the book, it's not the primary identification, but that we still have to work with this as a title.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of catch-all that we've been given to use. So we wanted to make that really explicit in the introduction and to try to kind of undo it and to make space for other people to kind of then exist in the contents. But because that work obviously comes after the invitations that you make, or that your pictures editor makes, I think in some cases that then became a sticking point where they just saw the kind of invitation to participate in the book of queer photography and immediately said no. The flip side of that is that like some of the photographers that we then started talking to, or who wanted to kind of read their profiles before they went into editing, we had really productive conversations with. I learned so much about different ways of kind of modulating or nuancing that word, or kind of displacing it. One photographer, for instance, Evan Benelli Atwood, who's Indigenous American, the kind of language around their positionality was really interesting and like really productive, because I think they're very open to being identified as queer, but then they have their own kind of set of terminology that is more primary to the work and to what it's doing in the context of their heritage and their kind of subjectivity. So profiles like that were really exciting to get to include and to be able to kind of work with the term and then also undermine it. And I think Charan is someone whose work does that in a big way as well.
Yeah, Charan Singh's work is like some of his essays about, you know, the use of queer in India or in Indian for like an Indian underclass context, and it's damaging use. It is really important how I think about this. And you know, it's referenced in the book. But I think that I kind of hate queer art as a label, and I think that anything where the text actually just starts with it, admits its usefulness as a cataloguing entry or whatever, but then starts with it and then maybe moves beyond it. I think is maybe where we are.
Yeah, I think you deal with that very well, because it is quite a tricky one to kind of be utilising a term that you also want to expand, but also know that it will be a helpful starting point. How did you actually write the book? Because the voice is quite sort of homogenous, and I thought I would be able to. I thought I'd be able to tell, oh, that's a Theo bit, that's a Flora bit, and I couldn't. And so I just wanted to know, like, what was the process between the two of you? Because you are co-writers, and you haven't got named sections on this.
We divided the chapters, did a first draft of each individually, and then swapped them back and forth relentlessly until our voices merged into one.
Wow.
To me, they still read quite different.
Yeah, to me they do too, but it's nice to know that.
Lots of people have said what you've said, so I think that's a good thing.
And did you remain friends during that process?
Yeah.
We're here.
It was very boring. It was very boring. There was no fight.
Oh, you're both too zen.
I don't know that we were during the process, but zen is maybe not the word I would use.
And I wondered whether you wanted to talk about one of your kind of favourite sections from the 10 chapters and just kind of open one up for the audience, because I would love to hear you talk about one of them.
Well, my favourite chapter is the materialities and abstractions one. That kind of introductory essay is my favourite bit, just for the way it kind of opens. It kind of opens the book up at that particular moment, or it's kind of moving towards a climax, and like a takeoff. Yeah. And I think that it was really fun to write about that work. That work looks really good, like in the book, and it does. I think maybe we were going to mention this, but we sort of had angsty discussions about the fact we've got too much figurative work. But then you're so often dealing with the figure in this area, and so we did try and make sure that we weaved a lot or as much as we could, of the non-figurative or the non-representational, and what the possibilities of that is, those are.
And within it, you sort of talk about the use of like photograms or kind of non-camera based photography, and almost sort of moving into sort of sculptural practices. And you sort of touch on the kind of emerging sort of theorisation of queer abstraction, which has become like a big topic of discussion. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that and kind of how, like, what your perspective is on how abstraction can be queer. Or is it too big?
I mean, I think it, you know, that for me, one of the Anya Gorkova's work speaks so beautifully to that, because they're using like a lot of their work uses chemicals, darkroom chemicals and darkroom processes, sort of waste chemical and materials to think around the idea of a fixed image, and to think into the idea of kind of making an image with no subject or with no kind of referent, which is really interesting then to think about from a kind of trans or non-binary perspective, the way that all the stuff that kind of pins someone down can also be used to sort of undo. So that's been really important to my thinking about how, how these kind of materialities can kind of surpass the photographic object and become something which sort of access to it. Which I think there's more and more work like that starting to happen, which is really exciting.
And it's like a chapter which sort of reminds the reader about the way the photograph is never just a window or a representation, but it's always, and you sort of said in your introduction about how you really wanted to have photography as this kind of active sort of agent that kind of runs through these different kinds of practices, and I think that does really come through in that section. Which one's your favourite, Flora?
My favourite section to write was the landscapes chapter, because it was just an interesting question to ask. What does a queer landscape, what would a queer landscape look like? It was also the first chapter that we worked on, and it was, I misread the word count. They sent us the kind of document saying this is how long everything should be, and I just was really stressed out and misread it and wrote 3 times as much as I was supposed to, and had a really good time doing it, and then had to go back and be like, all of this has to go. But it was, I don't know, it was kind of exciting for me to think around the idea of what a queer landscape would look like, or how photography can kind of work into a tradition of representing the landscape to do something to it. And because I love Jose Munoz, it also became a place for me to like vent that.
I distinctly remember, so Flora had to cut down the queer landscapes chapter, and then there was like a spare spread sometime near the end, and there was discussion about what this spare spread would be, and then it was decided it would go into the landscapes essay, and then I got a text from Flora being like, I'm gleefully adding back sections. Sections of that essay.
Always read your word count before you start writing is the lesson.
Well, I'm hoping maybe there'll be like some offshoots of these introductions into longer pieces, because I don't know whether you can paraphrase it, Flora, but the section on minor white I just thought was really...
I have a whole essay written about minor white that had to be cut out of. There was a page and a half on minor white that had to get condensed down to...
I mean, could you just like... I mean, you could either read a little bit or just talk about it, because it was a very beautiful way of thinking about what we imagine as a very like modernist, formalist, quite, you know, stereotypically masculine practice, and then you sort of kind of queer it in the way that you've talked about it.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what I wrote. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the sort of thinking that I was doing around this image, and the image that's in the book, I'm not sure if it's in the slideshow, is of a man kind of at the bottom of a hill, and there's a kind of parallel image that goes with it. There's two images. Like, we weren't able to include the second one, which is a shame because it kind of illustrates the point, but there's one of this man kind of at the foot of a hill, and then there's another image which is the landscape kind of expanded. You can see more of this kind of coastline in California that he's photographing, and it's a much more kind of typically straight photograph in the sense of straight photography as a sort of approach, very formal approach. And then there's this sort of beautiful companion image where the man is so close, the subject is so close to the lens, and it's like by kind of pulling in on the landscape, it creates this moment of intimacy where that straight photograph is undone, and something kind of starts to happen in it, which, you know, it is still quote unquote straight in the sense of his technique and his sort of approach to how he's making the photograph. But it kind of, it does something to sort of undo what that means. So I wish that we'd been able to include both photographs, but I guess the phrase that I have is that there's this sort of affective space that emerges between the two images that kind of registers this potential for modernism to sort of become queer in some way. I have pages about those two photographs.
I think it's just really nice for the audience to sort of get a sort of bit deeper into what is kind of in these little introduction sections, because it does feel like you've both done a huge amount of thinking and research in relation to them. And Flora and Theo touched upon this, but for each photographer there's just one image. Now that would be the bit that I would absolutely hate. So I wondered whether, like, how hard was it to choose one image to represent a career, and how did you decide?
In some cases really easy, and in some cases, I mean, it's all totally subjective. Like the Hujar, I'm obsessed with Hujar's photos of the river. So that was never a question. It's like, it has to be this photo. Because I love that photo more than most photos. So.
Yeah, I think there were cases where it was correct to choose the iconic photograph.
Yeah.
And there were cases where it was, you know, less important to do that. So like the Road to Me Fanny Coyote work, like that's very much the kind of picture that's known.
Yeah.
But I thought that was, you know, it's iconic, and that's kind of useful in a way. And so if you take the iconic image, you can kind of unpack it, or like, and put your own kind of spin on it. Also, some really great things like Kabina Mercer's essay on that is really useful. Whereas like this is not about identity, and I think that's great. And so that was useful for the book.
Trying to remind myself.
But then. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's also a kind of a balancing that we had to do in terms of reminding ourselves that this is a trade publication, and perhaps not everyone who picks it up will have spent the same amount of time obsessing over these things that we have. So I have like balancing images, you know, like Keela Beige's like really famous photo with things like Hujar's River, where you're kind of twisting it a little bit.
So that one's an interesting example, the Phyllis Christopher image, where which is right there. So, where the picture editor was like, you've chosen, like, it's not very good. Like, you should choose one that's more, you know, interesting. And we were like, actually, this is an opportunity to kind of thread kind of pro-life, like pro-life and abortion debates, like in there. So that was an opportunity.
And to kind of weave different politics together and to insist on a feminism within queerness.
Well, I'm very impressed. I would not. It would have just been too torturous to try and do that kind of like sort of trying to just have one piece. But hopefully, it is the kind of publication where if you've never seen that photographer before, that artist before, then, you know, kind of hopefully you'll then go and explore more of their work after you've seen it, and kind of
Yeah.
start little kind of, sort of treasure troves behind each picture. I mean, my final question is a very art historical one. What would the companion edited collection look like? I mean, in my mind, I was imagining a version of the Passionate Camera Volume 2. If Flora and Theo were editing that, what would you, like, from doing this, what would you feel like needs to be kind of in that?
The way I'll answer that is I'll start by talking about the Passionate Camera, because in this area you kind of think of it as like the text or like the place where lots of work is gathered together. So then you look at it and you realise it's actually a very slippery volume, and it doesn't necessarily actually do that kind of gathering work that you expect.
Yeah.
Like the essays are all concerned kind of with affect, and they are not kind of summative.
No.
And that was
Most edited collections are like that. You know, they kind of they have a promise of sort of coverage and breadth, but actually that's not how very many people write. And it's often very expensive to commission people to write those kinds of texts.
So then once I kind of looked at that book again, being like, oh, this wasn't what I remembered it was. And I was like, oh, we do have something to contribute. And then we have talked about doing a follow-up, like of more kind of art historical essays and getting commissions. And I guess it would be interesting to try and do that work.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I guess it's also probably worth saying that, like, not that this feels like a companion to, but probably an extension of in some ways. I don't know if it's an extension of, but because we work so much in the 80s, I've spent a lot of time with Stolen Glances. Theo spent a lot of time with ecstatic antibodies. And I think those are almost, like, for me, more the sort of urtext is the work that happened in a kind of British context in the 80s and 90s. But yeah, I think it would be nice to kind of spiral this out, and when we have more time.
We'll definitely be approaching you, Catherine.
It wasn't me pitching for work, but I'll take it. I'm sure there's lots of people in the audience who will also sign up. You have a sheet afterwards, you can put your abstracts down. The publication will be probably put together within the evening. But, on that note, I would like to open up to the audience for questions or suggestions of abstracts. And Matilda has a microphone, if you wouldn't mind waiting for.
Companion Madonna song.
Yeah. One question there.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for such a fascinating discussion. The book is fantastic, and I'm really glad that I could come and listen to you all tonight. I was wondering, it's more of a kind of big picture question, which I'm sure we can't answer tonight, but I just thought it was interesting to discuss. Why do you think photography and taking the photograph is something that these artists in particular reach for? Why is that the chosen medium? What is it about the photograph and its power that does something that another art form can't do?
Me first? Well, I can kind of only, I can answer from a subjective point of view, which is that working with a camera, having your picture taken, taking pictures is a particular kind of experience that enables particular kinds of things.
Also, one thing to say about the book, there's also kind of work that crosses over. You know, there's like a chapter that really thinks about performance and photography, and the kind of the chapter on abstraction. It's almost like sometimes approaching painting or a different sort of other or sculpture. And so, I guess.
I
I think like there isn't necessarily like a photographic one dimension, but there will be a number of them that operate in different kind of areas of different artists.
Yeah, just another way to say that would be that there's not a discipline.
Yeah, but I do think, like in terms of some of the historical, more, quote unquote historical, more historical images, there's an efficacy to photography that other mediums don't always have. I.e., it's easier to be a photographer than it is to be a painter. Not easier. You don't need a huge studio. Easier in the sense of kind of some resourcing questions, perhaps.
There are material parameters.
There are material parameters to being a photographer that that kind of make that work possible at certain points and in certain places where I think it can be harder with painting and sculpture and other kind of mediums that take up a huge amount of space in particular. And
Any other questions? People just desperate. Oh no, there's one there. They just want to get the copy of the book.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask about sort of the categorization of the images. So if you have the photography that's obviously with certain sections, is there any point of relation to, because you said it was like a single image per artist, is there any correlation that's between, say, an image by Hajar with then the thematic or something like that? And was that intentional?
What do you mean by correlation?
Is, like physically in the book, there's going to be photographs that are adjacent. Right?
yeah.
Is there like a correlation, or is it not? Is that not an intention?
I think each section there is like a flow between the artists that have been, like the images that have been put together, and so sometimes they're just drawn by the kind of the theme of that section. But what you were saying about not wanting it alphabetical, I read it that you kind of wanted the reader to see this picture and then that picture, and it might not be completely fixed, but there is like and then there are artists who reoccur across chapters, so there is like sort of somebody who might maybe I'll let you talk about that.
There's some people who crop up in multiple places, but there's also kind of cross-referencing between some of them. So I'm trying to remember a good example of this. Ruth.
Yeah.
What's her last name? It's been a while. What's her last name?
There. It was
Oh no. Ruth Bernhard, that's it. For instance, was Berenice Abbott's studio assistant or something like that. So there's these moments where people kind of like occur and reoccur and get kind of cross-referenced because these connections and webs start to kind of develop across sort of time and space, which does interesting things, I think, to the way that you read some of the artists as individuals.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we ever, well, we did look at there was an image document where there was just the pictures for a while, and to see what it kind of looked like, but I think that we always thought about the images as flowing through the text.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? I'm interested in sort of the geography of queer culture and looking at queer culture beyond the city and the urban environment. I'm wondering if that was a consideration that you guys had in your research.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a few kind of places and people that speak to that. In particular, Sabelo Malengi, for instance, who works in South Africa. A lot of his work is about the experience of being queer in a rural environment, kind of outside of the city. It was one of the things that the extended landscapes chapter spoke to before I was rudely cut off. But yeah, I think absolutely. and there's so much good writing, kind of like queer geography. It's that essay called like Get Thee to the City, about, the experience of kind of moving between urban and rural environments. And I think quite a few of the photographers kind of exist in and visualize their lives outside of that space, which is hopefully useful to kind of expand the picture of queerness as something that only exists in like London and New York and San Francisco.
Thank you. I think there was a question near the front and then a question, Fiona, at the back. Just,
Thank you for that talk. It was really interesting to hear the kind of, not backstory, but the kind of back process of the creating the book. So I had a comment and a question. The comment was just to kind of touch upon the list of texts you were talking about at the very beginning, that a new book came out this year on queer methodology for photography by also Johannesson.
Who's in this book?
Which is primarily, actually only uses photographers who identify as queer, so that's a good read. And then the other question was, I've only very briefly been able to skim read the book a few times, so I haven't been able to really get to the really core of it. But a lot of the reading I've been doing at the moment has been looking at how non-queer people can also queer things, and as you say in the book about non-queer photographers, queer photography. Do you think queer practitioners can create images that aren't queer, and why?
Yeah. There's a lot of very straight queer people. I mean, I do think that Amelia Jones phrase, like something having a queer effect, I find that so useful. The ways in which things which never had the intention of becoming queer become queer because you're the person receiving them. And so it's not, it's you interacting with an image or a thing or a song, any kind of mode of cultural making, I guess, and receiving it and it having that effect on you. I think by the same token, I don't think anything made by a queer person is necessarily queer. To me, that undoes the politics of queer.
I would just turn the question around and just think about what the image does.
yeah, thank you. Fiona?
I've already got the
Always, every day.
Sorry. So right at the beginning, Catherine, you mentioned some recent exhibitions that were very important when thinking about art and gender and thinking about queer photography. That's a question that I wanted to ask. Obviously, is Expressing Antibodies Resisting the AIDS Mythology, the exhibition book you mentioned as well. And I'm interested in the role that curating, exhibition making played in the conception and the development of the book, but also to open that out further, the role that you think exhibition making has played in the development of a queer history of photography.
Well, I would, the way I would think about that is in how throughout the book we're very insistent on the relation of photography to space, and like the spaces that it emerges out of, like the club, for example, is one kind of space, a space of documentation, but also a fantasy space and a space of material with bodies together, and then and how that the curation in that sense, and the way that photography emerges in and produces that space. There's definitely discussion of, I'm just thinking of Kiss and Tell, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the way that exhibition making kind of knocks on to or informs what you would maybe call a queer history of photography, Ecstatic Antibodies, Stolen Glances, and Kiss and Tell, I think, are all really pivotal
Yeah,
to kind of creating that field.
and identifying networks.
Yeah, which often overlap in ways across these projects.
Yeah, so like the book, I think we say this in the introduction, this is maybe getting slightly away from curating, but like in the introduction, so say like the book is kind of focused on individuals, but I think they're always interested in like where they came from and who they were working with and how they emerged. Like, so there's not necessarily interest in biography, but more like a picture of structure and how productive it is.
Have we answered your question? I'm not sure we have.
I mean, there's also been a number of artists in the exhibition have had sort of big exhibitions or important exhibitions over the last few years, and I wondered whether kind of as you were working on it, were you sort of seeing the kind of the representation of various photographers and whether that sort of shifted your thinking?
So that was part of what made it so difficult to compile the list, is that things were always happening, and then we always had to go back to those.
It's not very but it's very interesting to think about, you know, this 80s show that's on at Tate Britain right now.
Yeah.
And like the work in that, and then the way some of that work was also in Women in Revolt, which wasn't very long ago, and is still on in Edinburgh. So, you know, there's a sense in which, I don't know what to say, there's a kind of moment of visibility and saturation, in fact, maybe.
I think so.
Which was not the case when we started.
Well, I think I would like to close the formal section of this session there, and before we thank Theo and Flora, I just want to remind everyone that you're all welcome to come and have a drink just down the corridor. You turn right, and then just on your turn right and right, Research Forum Seminar Room, and you can also purchase copies of the book, get them signed by the fair authors. But before we do that, I would just like to thank Theo and Flora very much.
Thank you.